Greetings, car fanatics. Today I'll be showing you how to change out the brake pads and rotors on my 2010 911 Carrera S. This is super easy to do and should apply for most 911s or any car with this style of Brembo brakes. To start, let's talk about what you'll need. First, you'll need brake rotors. I'll be using the Bosch QuietCast brake rotors. I'll also be using a set of TRW ceramic brake pads. My current brake pads are pretty new, however they're semi-metallic so they dust like crazy. As for special tools, you'll need a brake pad spreader, a 10mm hex socket, a punch or an old screwdriver, and a hammer. Additionally, you'll need other basic tools. You'll also need a ratchet. I have a couple here. You'll need a torque wrench. You also need to have a few various screwdrivers and pliers. Now moving on to chemicals, it's helpful to use some WD-40. You also need some Loctite. You also need some anti-seize to prevent seizing on certain parts. Moving on to safety equipment, it's helpful to have knee pads and a seat so you can work comfortably. Also, you'll need to have some eye protection and very important, a face mask. It's extremely important that you use a face mask when working on your brakes because it kicks up a lot of brake dust and you definitely don't want to inhale this stuff, so protect your lungs. Lastly, you'll need a jack and jack stands to lift up your car. Alright, so let's get started. The first thing you want to do is remove a little bit of brake fluid from the reservoir. I'm doing this using a turkey baster. So when you install your new brake pads, you'll need to compress the brake caliper pistons, which will push the fluid back into the reservoir. If your brake fluid reservoir is too full, some of the brake fluid can overflow and come out. So assuming your brake fluid is still in good condition, you want to take just a little bit out, put it in a clean container so you can reuse it later. Alright, so moving on to the front brakes, I have the car all lifted up and the wheels are moved. If you want to see how to lift up a 911, take a look at my previous video by clicking on this info card button. I'll also include a link in the description below along with links to where you can find these parts and tools. So the brake pads are super easy to replace on Brembos. You'll need to remove this black pin here which holds the brake pad retaining spring. Then you disconnect the brake pad sensors and remove the retaining spring. This should allow you to just pull out the brake pads. To remove the pin, start by removing this small cotter pin. You can just grab it with pliers and pull it off. Now we're ready to tap out the brake pad retaining pin. Take your punch and hammer and gently tap it from the front of the brake caliper towards the back. After you've pushed it out just a little bit, you can use a pair of vice grips to pull it out. If you're getting a little too much resistance, you can also add a few drops of WD-40 and this will help loosen things up. Now we're ready to disconnect the brake pad sensor. For the fronts, you can easily pull the sensor out with your hand, then disconnect the sensor wire from the brake pad retaining spring and pull the retaining spring out. Follow the wire back and you'll see that it connects to this little connection here. Just slip up this metal thing and pull out the connector. Porsche recommends you change out the brake pad sensors. However, if you haven't triggered the wear indicator and you carefully remove your sensors, you can reuse them without any issues. With the brake pads exposed, you now want to spread the brake pads. This is important because the new brake pads are thicker than your worn out brake pads, so you'll need to make room for them. You don't want to push on the caliper pistons directly, so I like to spread the caliper pistons while the brake pads are still in. Take your brake pad spreader and open up the brake pads until the brake pad caliper pistons are almost fully depressed. So here's what you should be able to do to pull out your brake pads. However, the brake pads have a dampener plate on the back side which sticks to the brake pads with adhesive and attaches to the brake caliper pistons. You'll need some kind of flat metal tool to separate the dampers from the brake pads. However, I don't have one, so I'm going to remove the brake calipers and show you how to remove it this way. For the front brake calipers, you have this brake line bracket that you'll need to remove first. Okay, so here it is. It's just held on by a 10mm bolt, which you'll need to remove. Be careful when removing this bolt because in the past I have broken it. It's a small bolt and over time it could get a little seized up. So apply a little bit of WD-40 and that should help you get the bolt out without any issues. Okay, with the bolt out, we're ready to remove the brake caliper itself, which is held on by two 10mm hex bolts. It's only torqued to around 60 foot-pounds, so it should be pretty easy to get it off. Before you completely remove these bolts, be sure to have some string or a bungee cord to hang your brake caliper. You don't want to hang your brake calipers by the brake lines or you can cause some major damage. Now we have the brake caliper off and we're ready to remove the brake pads. Take a flathead screwdriver and gently loosen up the pads. You should then just be able to pull out the brake pads with your hands. Alright, so here we have the brake pad dampeners that I was referring to. We'll just need to remove these dampeners with a screwdriver so we can reuse them. Now when you put these back on, you can re-glue them to your brake pads to prevent squealing. However, I found that the adhesive used remains sticky enough to adhere to your new brake pads. Take the dampeners and put them back into your caliper while keeping in mind that the things that stick out are different sizes, so these dampeners only fit into your brake calipers one way. Now put your brake caliper back onto the rotor because the pads are going to be going into your caliper from the outside. You can use a brake caliper bolt to hold your brake caliper in place and remove the string or bungee cord you're using to support your brake caliper. Before you put your new brake pads in, it's important to use some brake lubricant on any part of the brake pad that's going to make contact with something. This will prevent brake noise and reduce the wear on your different components. The brake pads slide on the retaining pin over here, so you'll want to add a little bit of lube. Also, this part of the brake pad slides on some guides within the caliper, so just add a little lubricant while being sure you don't get any lubricant on the friction side of the brake pad. Now just slide the brake pads in. Reinsert your brake pad sensors and reinstall the brake pad retaining spring and pin, and you should be good to go. Now we're ready to reinstall the 10mm bolt for your brake line bracket. I recommend adding a little bit of anti-seize so you don't have any issues removing this next time. So we're on the final step for the front brake pads. You want to reinstall the brake caliper bolts. Apply some Loctite to each, then torque them down to 63 foot-pounds. Alright, now it's time to move on to the rear brakes. To get to the rotors, you'll need to remove the brake pads and calipers. The process for the rear is pretty much identical to the front, so I'm going to speed through this part. You'll want to remove the brake pads after you remove the brake calipers because these brake pads also have dampeners on the back. Again, if you have some type of flat tool and you're just changing the pads, you can pry this off and remove the brake pads without removing the caliper. Take off the brake pad dampeners from your old pads and put them back into the caliper. Now we're ready to remove the brake rotor. For the rear brake rotors, it has built-in drums for your parking brakes, so make sure your parking brake is disengaged or you won't be able to remove the rotor. Remove the two retaining screws. If you haven't removed these in a while, you can use some WD-40 to help loosen them up, and if they're in good shape, you can reuse them. Now simply pull off your rotor. As you can see, it's really easy. Before reinstalling the new brake rotor, take some anti-seize and apply it to the hub. Spread a thin coat over the entire area and make sure you're evenly coating this. This will prevent the rotor from seizing to this hub next time you remove the brake rotor. Now reinstall the brake rotor. We can now reinstall the brake caliper and brake pads in the same manner as the front. Put back on your brake pad retaining spring, pin, and brake pad sensors. And finally, reinstall the brake caliper bolts with Loctite and torque them down to 63 foot-pounds. So for the final step, pump your brakes and then take your old brake fluid and put it back into the reservoir and just make sure it reaches the full level. Alright, car fanatics, so there you have it. As you can see, it's very straightforward to change out the brake pads and rotors on a 911. This process is very similar to how you would do it on most cars. Generally, brakes are easy, but where things get hard is if you're dealing with a lot of corrosion. Just make sure you have the proper tools and parts, assess the situation as you go, and take your time. Well, thanks for watching, car fanatics. I hope this video was helpful. If you like this video, give it a thumbs up and subscribe to the channel. Leave any questions or comments below, and be sure to click on the bell so you are notified each time I upload a new video.